We're coming off week 14 with some enormous performances that I hope you were on the right side of the equation with. And now we're going into our fantasy playoffs with our gloves off. It is gloves off time going into the fantasy playoffs, and we need to get our rankings right with the running backs here. So we're going through our top 30 running back rankings for the fantasy playoffs, and I'm giving away 5 free FN hats for when I hit 19,000 subscribers. And the way to qualify to get one is to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel, and give me your hottest take for week 15 fantasy football. So getting into our first tier right here, I still think he needs to be separated on his own. What he has done and what he is on pace for this year is absolutely absurd. He's the running back 1 by more than 20 points. He's dominating the running back 2. And that, of course, is Saquon freaking Barkley. Saquon Barkley right now is just on an unbelievable tear. I want to give you an example. Like, he played so well against the Carolina Panthers last week. He just didn't get in the end zone, so he obviously didn't get the headlines of having a massive day like a bunch of other guys did in fantasy football. But what he did in that game was rush for over 120 yards. Big deal at this point. But he's still averaging 22 fantasy points per game, and he gets the matchups. He gets Pittsburgh this week, which is definitely the toughest by far, because then he gets Washington and Dallas. This guy, the tear that he's on, I don't care about matchup at this point. He's in his own tier. And dropping down to our next tier, we've got Joe Mixon and Bijan Robinson at 2 and 3. So with Joe Mixon here, as far as fantasy points per game goes, Joe Mixon is averaging 19.9 fantasy points per game. That is the number 2 running back in fantasy points per game, right in front of Derrick Henry and right behind Saquon Barkley. So what Joe Mixon has been able to do has been season long. And probably, honestly, the injury to him like early in the season may have very well helped Joe Mixon, because he's been sustained, unlike an Alvin Kamara in fantasy production, who we'll get to later in the video. Joe Mixon, it's working still. So he gets Miami, Kansas City, and Baltimore. And I would say definitely Kansas City's a tougher matchup, and probably Baltimore as well. But again, just what he's doing and against tougher teams throughout the entire duration of the year is pretty ridiculous. And with Bijan Robinson here at the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Giants and at Washington, that's his playoff schedule. So I'll level with people here. The Falcons are on like a 4-game losing streak. They look horrific because Kirk Cousins is actively crumbling before our eyes. I pointed this out last week, and it is true. But the one thing that isn't crumbling is Bijan Robinson's fantasy production. This guy is still averaging basically like 20 points per game over the last month and a half of fantasy football. So just the run that he's on right now, and just the way that he's getting in the end zone consistently, even when Tyler Algier gets in the end zone in week 14, I think Bijan Robinson is a shoo-in top 3 guy. And I think Josh Jacobs at the end of this tier belongs here. This guy has been on a freaking tear. Like, over the last 2 months, this guy's a top 3 fantasy back. He's been absolutely absurd with what he's been able to do. He has 11 rushing touchdowns, and mind you, he didn't have, I think, 1 in September. Like, he may have had 1. But that was it. Like, his September, people were like, should I trade this guy away? Should I just start benching him? It's like, guys, this guy's hitting at the right time. I love the way Josh Jacobs is running, and this Green Bay offense has become run first. So he gets Seattle, he gets New Orleans, and Minnesota. And again, you've got a really tough matchup with Minnesota, but outside of that, Seattle's hit or miss and New Orleans is hit or miss. I can definitely see Josh Jacobs continue this run, because he just put up 3 touchdowns, should have been 4, against the Detroit Lions defense. It doesn't matter with matchup in this tier. Dropping down to our next tier, I think matchup starts to come into play a little bit. We get Derrick Henry and Devon Achane at 5 and 6. So with Derrick Henry, obviously he's the number 2 running back in fantasy right now, and he's still averaging 19.1 fantasy points per game. But if you specifically look over the last month of fantasy, he's had games like 13.6, 10.5, 14, 12.6 in a half PPR format. And that's because 2 out of those 4 games he didn't rush for a touchdown. And so kind of what we get here with Derrick Henry is, unless he gets in the end zone, it's not going to be as good of a week for Derrick Henry. So I just think that he's just a little bit, he's a little older, and he's at the point of his career where he can't sustain just massive fantasy production. So he gets the bye week. I think that comes in perfectly for Derrick Henry, and he does get one great matchup versus the Giants coming off of the bye. I think this is where Derrick Henry can go nuclear right here, because after that, Pittsburgh and Houston, those are tough matchups here. So I think Derrick Henry is definitely a tier below those other guys, because I don't see him sustaining like 20-point production throughout the playoffs. And then Devon Achane here. You know, the funny thing about Achane that I've been pointing out for the last several weeks is if you actually look at him efficiently, like his efficiency on the ground over the last month has been pretty putrid. 4.3 yards per carry was the best. That was in week 11. Then you go to week 12, 3.2, 2.0, and 1.7. Like, the Dolphins cannot run the ball very effectively right now. Where Devon Achane saves the fantasy production is he's always getting in the end zone once a week. That's a fact. Like, that guy is averaging, you know, a touchdown per game easy. And he also gets tons of receiving upside. So just based on that alone, I've got to keep him inside of the top 6 here. And he gets Houston, San Francisco, and Cleveland. San Fran and Cleveland, not particularly tough matchups here. I think Devon Achane, just the way that he's been playing, is just like gonna guarantee you fantasy upside just because of the fact that he gets tons of pass catching work. And Jahmyr Gibbs and Chase Brown are at 7 and 8 here. So when I look at Jahmyr Gibbs here, you know, his last 2 games, I guess, have been a little bit disappointing. Like, he had 9.4 fantasy points and 16.3 the last 2 games in a half PPR format, which, you know, are not bad weeks at all. That's why, like, he can't rank much lower than this because his floor is so solid. So I guess really what it comes down to is every single week, this team can go either David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs, and sometimes they'll both have really good games, but that doesn't mean that you should look at Jahmyr Gibbs as anything outside of a really solid and consistent high upside fantasy running back. He can absolutely give you a 30-point game, and he gets the Bills, the Bears, and then the 49ers. So those last 2 matchups in particular, they're really strong, and Buffalo, by the way, is very beatable on the ground. Chase Brown at number 8. With Chase Brown, I'm filming this before tonight's game, Dallas and Cincinnati, so I don't know how Chase Brown performed, but all I can do is look at like the last month with Chase Brown, and it's been pretty phenomenal in fantasy football. This is reminding me of an Austin Eckler type of season, because if you look at his, you know, yards per carry on the ground, he's not exactly the best running back. He's more Eckler than he is Derrick Henry. But this guy is getting so many targets per game, and he's usually getting in the end zone once per game, either through a goal line touchdown or just a pass catching touchdown. This guy over the last month, 24.2, 17, 16.8, 17.5 fantasy points in half PPR formats. Like, this guy has done really well. I don't expect that to change anytime soon because this offense is still really, really capable of scoring 30 plus points. And then with Kyren Williams at number 9 here, I think that Kyren Williams revived my confidence in him just a little bit in week 14 versus the Buffalo Bills. Now, that game, I think, was an outlier of all outliers. Like, the Rams were unstoppable versus the Buffalo Bills defense, which is very good, by the way. They couldn't be stopped. And, you know, the problem that I've had with Kyren Williams over the weeks is that he's been a little infrequent on rushing touchdowns, and at the same time, you know, he's actually lost a little bit of volume over the last several weeks. Like, over the last several weeks, 15, 15, 16, 15 carries. And he finally gets back to 29 carries in week 14. We need the volume, for sure. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this one, because he's been a little bit infrequent getting in the end zone, and he doesn't have a ton of pass catching upside over the last month or so. So he gets the 49ers, the Jets, and the Cardinals here. I think they're all pretty good matchups. It comes down to how much work is he going to be handling, and that's why he's down here at number 9, because I'm a little uncertain about that. Dropping now to our next tier right here. It's time to give these guys their dues. Chuba Hubbard at 10 and Isaac Guerrero at 11. Chuba Hubbard, you all know, I'm the maniac from the offseason who was shouting to you about Chuba Hubbard because I said he's going to be a freaking league winner. And he's really turned into exactly that. Like, and I was even wrong about him in week 14. Versus the Eagles, I didn't really want much to do with him. This guy has been so good this year. 18.7 points, half PPR against the Philadelphia Eagles defense, who's been outrageously good. 26 carries is what he's going to continue to get. Because just before I started filming, Jonathan Brooks confirmed torn ACL in the same knee. So he's done, basically before the season got started. But Chuba Hubbard was realistically never ceding volume to Jonathan Brooks. It was never going to happen. The way he has played this year, this team is not moving off them when they're actually competing, like, really hard, like, really playing good football right now, the Carolina Panthers are. So he gets Dallas, he gets Arizona, he gets Tampa Bay. They're good matchups here outside of Arizona. Chuba Hubbard's top 10. And then Isaac Guerrero here obviously comes in, gets 2 touchdowns, does really well in his first game versus the Bears. It was to be expected. The Bears' one weakness this year has been against running backs. And Isaac Guerrero, his future matchups here, he gets one tough one against Detroit, but the Miami and the Los Angeles Rams game, those are definitely beatable. And the one thing that you can count on with a Kyle Shanahan run offense is he wants to use one running back as a workhorse. That's why his 2 workhorses have gone down for the season, because he overuses running backs. Guerrero's going to hit at the perfect time of the year. This guy is easily a league-winning type of player, and I hope that you have him. And if he's by chance on your waiver wires, you need to get this guy right away. And then at 12 and 13, James Conner and James Cook. Listen, with James Conner here, this guy has actually played really well, and it's so weird because usually at this time of the year, he's slowing down or he's starting to get injured a little bit. James Conner against Seattle had the best game of his season, 20.2 fantasy points. And that kind of is a reason he's down here a little bit lower, is because his ceiling is just a little bit lower than some of the top guys in these next couple tiers above him. But with James Conner here, he doesn't look like he's losing volume. He doesn't look like he's losing efficiency. And Trey Benson, yes, he's been playing well, but James Conner's also been playing too good to lose the starting spot. And with James Cook, I've kind of got the opposite fear. The guy I know is really good. I know he's a super efficient running back. When they give him the volume, he's a beast. He can easily take over a game. But James Cook, last week in week 14, was the perfect example of my problem with James Cook. He got 6 carries and 20 yards and only 2 targets for 9 yards in a game where they scored 40 plus points. That's the danger of being a Buffalo Bills running back. They easily can give Josh Allen 3 rushing touchdowns, which he got for a fantasy day that was legendary, but it left James Cook out. That's my problem here with James Cook. He gets a tough matchup versus Detroit right away in the playoffs, but then he gets New England and New York. I think those are good matchups, but at the same time, I've got real issues with James Conner just because I don't trust James Cook's, level of volume in the playoffs. I just can't trust it. David Montgomery at 14 belongs in this tier. The guy is so consistent. Like he's a touchdown lock every single week, regardless of who he plays. He's got 12 rushing touchdowns on the year, and this guy you can count on also a little bit of target share. Like this guy's, low-key been getting like 3 targets per game over the last 2 months or so. It's actually kind of just bust-proof from every angle. This guy has only scored 1 game this year with less than 10 fantasy points. So just the floor is so safe, and his ceiling is probably about 20 to 23 points depending on your format. So with Dave Montgomery here, I don't care about matchups. It's not really relevant at this point. I just think you need to accept that this guy is going to be able to be a very sustainable force throughout your fantasy playoff stretch. Dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got Breece Hall at 15 and Bucky Irving at 16. Now listen, with Breece Hall, obviously our next, 2 guys are injured here. These 2 particular guys, they have not received a clean bill of health in a while. Like Breece Hall has been dealing with his knee injury for weeks now, and Bucky Irving's been dealing with several injuries for a couple weeks now as well. Bucky left the game early, and Breece didn't even play in week 14. Now with Breece, the team says they don't plan to shut the guy down. They're planning on using him again this year when he's ready to go, whether it's week 15 or week 16. It's hard to know exactly what's coming for him. But I know what can happen is he can go off. He can easily go off against anybody. His ceiling is definitely 30 plus points, which he's done a couple times this year. But his floor is really low right now. And I feel the same way about Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving is questionable moving forward because I don't know what's going to happen. Is he returning this week? Honestly, I'd be a little bit surprised. But if he does come back for week 16 and 17, the matchups are awesome. Dallas and Carolina. And that's exactly why if he doesn't come back, Rachaad White has to be here at 17. Because the realistic thing is like Rachaad White has actually revived his fantasy upside. Last week, just in week 14 versus the Las Vegas Raiders, he played a really, really good game. Rachaad White is actually running the ball more efficient, and we already know the guy's a good pass-catching running back here. So in these last 2 matchups here, I don't care which one of them it is. I think that if Bucky is there, Bucky's definitely the best guy. But if he's not there, Rachaad White is easily a league-winning type of running back here because he is turning it on at the right time right here. So he's right here behind Bucky at 17 because I don't know what to do with Bucky right now. We'll just have to watch the injury status on this one. Jonathan Taylor at 18 and Alvin Kamara at 19. Listen, I like both these guys, but it's kind of time that we just put them where they belong right now. With Jonathan Taylor, I've pointed this out over the last several weeks. There's a problem right now with Jonathan Taylor, which is that he's not really been super efficient over the last month or so in fantasy football. Like since week 9, 3.7, 5.4, 2.4, 3.2, and 3.8 yards per carry. That's not good. And the problem is he hasn't scored a rushing touchdown over that stretch. Why is that? Because Anthony Richardson is doing exactly what fantasy managers feared before the season, which is that he's taking goal line touches away from Jonathan Taylor. That's the problem here. And he doesn't catch tons of passes. He's, basically averaging no more than, 3 targets per game over the last 2 months. So I just don't really see tons of upside right now, especially when he gets Denver right out of the gate. Now, Tennessee and New York are definitely good matchups here, but I have significant issues with his upside at this point. And I feel the same about Kamara. The one thing with Kamara is that his floor is pretty safe. He's rarely going to get you a single-digit game just because of the amount of sheer volume he gets through targets, man. At the very least, 5 targets per game. That's what we're getting from Alvin Kamara. But at the same time, he is not hitting a ceiling game. This guy has not hit a 20-point game since week 9. And since week 9, he's hit 1 since week 4. That's he is not doing it. There's no ceiling anymore with Alvin Kamara. He front-loaded his production, and that was the fear I had the entire year with Alvin Kamara. He's older. It's just, he's on a bad offense. This offense is completely stripped from playmakers, so all they have to do is give Alvin Kamara the ball in any way they can. He's getting 20 plus opportunities easily per game, and he's just simply not capable of handling that much work anymore because he's older. So yes, very safe floor, but at the same time, very low ceiling at this point. Aaron Jones at 20, rounding out this tier. Listen, with Aaron Jones here, I've kind of given this guy the shaft a little bit lately, and it's not because I don't like the talent. I love the talent. I've had an oversight with this one, to be honest with you guys, because I've said that this guy's ceiling and floor there's such a variance between the two that I have trouble ranking him. Honestly, when you look at this guy's numbers, it's actually been a pretty safe floor. He's had 2 single-digit performance games in fantasy since their week 6 bye. He's been really good in fantasy football. And I guess the one thing that worries me is the volume he gets on a weekly basis, and that does worry me, but he's still so efficient on a per-touch basis that it shouldn't worry me this much. So he gets Chicago, he gets Seattle, he gets Green Bay, who are all beatable on the ground. I think Aaron Jones is a really good upside play still. Dropping down to our next tier right here. Brian Robinson Jr. at 21 and Tyrone Tracy at 22. Now with Brian Robinson Jr., this is easily the hardest guy for me to rank right now, and I'll tell you exactly why. Brian Robinson Jr., I've been highlighting over the last several weeks. This guy has been, he's barely in on 50% of the snaps since he got injured back in September. Since week 5, here's a snap count percentage. 34%, 38%, 47%, 53%, 17, and 47. This guy has only been in on more than 50% of the snaps one time since the months of September. And still during that time, he's actually been able to provide you, crazy enough, a relatively stable floor. It's really weird. He can give you an 8-point game, but most of the time it's 13 to 17 points. Very hard to rank this guy because I don't know where he stands to come out after the bye week with his injury. I like his potential for sure, and the potential for some matchups here against New Orleans and Atlanta specifically, definitely high. But at the same time, I don't know what to do with Brian Robinson. I'll just be honest with you guys. I think he's a good upside play and a relatively safe floor play, but at the same time, if he doesn't get in the end zone, this guy's not providing you very much. Tyrone Tracy Jr., listen, if he was on the Bengals or if he was on the Dallas Cowboys even, I think he'd be ranked much higher. I hate this team. This team is horrific. And I'll give Tyrone Tracy Jr. his flowers. I like him a lot as a player. He's been very efficient. He's been one of the lone bright spots of this team. But at the same time, this guy is on a bad run franchise. So that's the only thing that puts worry in my heart, is that can they even score 10 points on a weekly basis? Unless it's him, probably not. Because this guy is saving their bacon every week. He gets Baltimore, Atlanta, and Indy. 2 out of 3 strong matchups here, but I hate the New York Giants, and I can't trust them. And that's why I'm safeguarding myself down here at 22. And I feel the exact same about Rico Dowdle here. The one problem I've had with Rico Dowdle over the weeks is that this team, if they get blown out, they easily stray away from the run. Easily. And I know that sounds like an obvious thing. Like, a lot of teams stray away from the run when they're chasing points. But at the same time, like, Dallas is very comfortable straying away from the run, even if they're in a tighter matchup. Like, in those blowout games that they lost to versus Philly and versus Houston, he had 7.1 fantasy points on 4.4, and he barely played 50% of the snaps. I just don't know. Like, they might get blown out in week 17 versus Philly and possibly week 16 versus Tampa. I think they'll play the Panthers tough, but at the same time, like I said, my issue with Rico Dowdle is what his level of involvement is on a week-to-week basis. Dropping down to our next tier, Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker at 24. Let me spend specific time on KW. I think that had he been healthy the entire season and Zach Charbonnet hadn't been there, I think Kenneth Walker would be a top 10 fantasy back at the very least. I think he's a great player, but he's injured right now. And he just missed the week 14 game. I don't know when he's coming back, first of all. And second of all, even when this guy has played, as of late, he's not been very good in fantasy. Like, he's been hitting big time bad games. 5.6 fantasy points week 13. He had 8, in week 8 he had 6.5, and his ceiling over that time in between then has been like 12.2, 12.9 fantasy points per game. The guy's either not healthy or he just isn't very good right now. One of the two I don't prefer. So I still like him, still like the potential. I know he can hit a ceiling game, but right now I've got major question marks. And Tony Pollard at 25 and Isaiah Pacheco at 26. With Tony Pollard, I think this guy, I pointed it out. With his game splits, when Tyjae Spears is there and when he's not there, they're two different players. Pollard's averaging like 14 fantasy points per game without Tyjae Spears, and like now, probably about 9 fantasy points with Tyjae Spears. But a lot of times, outside of week 14, this guy has been splitting work with Tyjae Spears. I don't trust this offense, man. So even though he gets Cincinnati and Indianapolis and Jacksonville, I think that if Tyjae Spears is there, I can't trust Tony Pollard. I like the upside. I don't like the floor at all. I feel the same about Pacheco. I think that with Pacheco, there's a possibility that he comes back and starts playing, really well again. He looked better in his second week back for sure. But this guy is not hitting like a massive game as of right now. He gets Cleveland, he gets Houston, he gets Pittsburgh. These are tough matchups here. Tough lines to walk with Isaiah Pacheco. Now again, I think it really just comes down to, can he get in the end zone at some point? Because that's kind of what it's going to take. I don't know if we're going to see the same explosion out of him until 2025. I just don't know if we're going to see that again from Isaiah Pacheco. And Najee Harris at 27 and Ramondre Stevenson at 28. Najee Harris here at Philadelphia, at Baltimore versus Kansas City. Tough matchups to end it off on for sure. But Najee Harris here, I actually think that his floor is actually a little bit unpredictable, but over the last month or so, 11.3, 11.3, 6.4, 21.9, and 11.3 fantasy points. This guy has been getting in the end zone more consistently, and he's actually seeing a decent amount of target share. Now, last week he didn't get any targets versus the Cleveland Browns in week 14, but I think that with this guy in these matchups here, specifically versus Philadelphia and Baltimore, those two teams have very, very fierce pass rushes to where I think Najee's going to be getting plenty of work out of the backfield. Not tons of ceiling, but I think a relatively safe floor. And with Ramondre, I think Ramondre's floor is actually really unstable, but his ceiling, I still think is 20 plus points. But this guy has not hit 20 points since week 9. My problem all year has been this offense sucks. And I can't predict, I don't like the fact that he's on a bad offense because he can get inefficient and sometimes lose volume when they're getting crushed. So, yes, I like Ramondre, but Arizona, I think can crush them. Buffalo is definitely going to crush them. And the Chargers week 17, we'll see about that. These are matchups I don't particularly like for Ramondre Stevenson, man. I've got to have him here at 28. And I specifically wanted to wall these two guys off in their own tier to end it off with. DeAndre Swift at 29 and Jaylen Warren at 30. With DeAndre Swift, this is an objective fact at this point. This is the only guy who benefited from Shane Waldron being the offensive coordinator in Chicago, because since he left, this guy has had 8 fantasy points, 8.4 and 4.5. This guy has done nothing without Shane Waldron. He's losing volume. He's injured right now. It is not working well, and this team is collapsing. They get Minnesota, Detroit, and Seattle ended off with. That is a horrific way to end the year. His upside, it's out of the window. It's gone. No more. We got what we needed from Swift a little bit early on. It's over at this point, man. This guy has a relatively safe floor because he's still a starter if he plays, but this guy I don't have confidence in. And Jaylen Warren, I think that honestly, his floor has become relatively safe, but his ceiling is obviously not very high. With Jaylen Warren, he's getting consistently, at least like 6 to 7 carries per game, and he's gonna get you 4 to 5 targets per game. And he's so efficient on every single touch that his floor has become basically 7 to 8 points depending on your format. Half PPR, full PPR is probably close to 10. But in his ceiling is definitely going to be whether he gets in the end zone or not at the goal line. He's not going to hit like a 70+ yard screen pass or anything like that. That's just not the way the Steelers run their offense. But Jaylen Warren, make no mistake, is a relatively safe floor play at this point. So let me know what your team looks like heading into week 1 of the fantasy playoffs. And stay tuned because this week is all about the fantasy playoffs.